Welcome to this special Momentum TV documentary called Mortal Midnight. It is my testimony in Vietnam experience. This documentary is dedicated to all our men and women who ever wore our uniforms in all our wars, and those that served in peacetime, those that served in NATO, but this is especially dedicated to the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. All gave some gave all.
The fighting on Hill 327 is documented by K.W. Nolan in Death Valley, Dell Books, 1987, page 29, and The Illustrated History of the Marines, the Vietnam War, Bantam Books, page 14. Mortal Midnight, the Vietnam experience of Sergeant Danny Daniels, USMC. February 23, 1969, Hill 327, Da Nang, South Vietnam. After midnight, suicide squads of Viet Cong and NVA started their assault on Hill 327. Lance Corporal Danny Daniels was among a few dozen Marines guarding the ridgeline, also known as Purple Heart Ridge. Lance Corporal Daniels was assigned to listening post number 8, a bunker on the ridgeline. At 12:30 a.m., the suicide squad breached the wire and jumped into the bunker at LP number 8. The suicide squads were called sappers. They would tie grenades and dynamite to their bodies, then jump into foxholes and bunkers occupied by American troops. As they blew themselves up, they would also kill everyone in the bunker. That morning, the sappers killed the Marines in the bunker at LP number 8. After the sappers did their job, the regular assault wave of NVA attacked the Marines on the hill. They fired mortars and RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, on the Marine positions. After heavy fighting, the Marines fought off the attack, and by 2 o'clock a.m., all was quiet on the ridgeline. Lance Corporal Daniels' life was spared from death on the bunker at LP number 8 by a chance trade of places. Less than an hour before the first suicide wave after midnight, another Marine, Corporal Vic, traded places with Lance Corporal Daniels. During the suicide charge, Corporal Vic was in Daniels' place in the bunker, and Lance Corporal Daniels was outside. Corporal Vic died instead of Lance Corporal Daniels. At 4 o'clock a.m., a second assault wave of Viet Cong sappers attacked the ridgeline. This time they managed to overrun the Marine position and plant a communist flag on the hill. A fierce battle went on, including some hand-to-hand combat. The Marines finally repulsed this second attack and halted the NVA drive. Lance Corporal Daniels' position took to direct hits, but he was again spared. At sunrise, the scorched ridgeline was a shambles of spent rounds and mangled bodies. 20 years later, Daniels recalls that morning. I shook after it was all over, thinking about what had happened. I remember standing next to what was left of my bunker and wondering why. Why was I spared? I had seen blood and death plenty of times before up in Phu Bai, but this was too close, too personal. I literally felt rounds go past my head and heard the thump of bullets inches away from me. That was nothing compared to how I felt when I realized somebody else died in my place. My name should be on the wall in Washington, but somebody took my place. A life exchange took place outside Da Nang 20 years ago. 2,000 years ago, an even more amazing life exchange took place when Jesus Christ gave his life on the cross. When Corporal Vic swapped places, it was done on a whim, a spur-of-the-moment choice. Christ's exchange on the cross was part of a divine plan and no accident, says Daniels, now a Baptist minister and broadcaster. Christ has taken our place on the cross and paid for the penalty of every sin. The exchange at the bunker in Vietnam only gave extension to physical life.
And welcome. I'm Dale Davidson. I'm very pleased to have with me today Sergeant Danny Daniels of the U.S. Marine Corps. Why do I say that when he's a pastor and he's a doctor as well, a theologian and a evangelist? It's because once a Marine, always a Marine. Right, Sergeant?
Semper Fi, devil dog. Hoorah!
We're going to talk a little bit about your Vietnam experience as a Marine. And then later on in this program, we're going to have the opportunity to hear your entire message, which is called Mortal Midnight. And I understand that you've given this testimony all over the world. Tell me about that a little bit.
I've preached it at Billy Graham Crusade venues. I've preached it in Promise Keeper wake-up calls, legacy builders, a lot of evangelism conferences, a bunch of men's retreats. But the amazing thing is I've preached it in secular areas like Veterans of Foreign War rallies, conventions, American Legion meetings, Marine Corps League meetings, and of course I'm wearing my Marine Corps League hat. And so I had some great experience in sharing the message and the testimony and relating to people. And because of that message, it resonates with men. I mean, it makes an impact on men, especially the kind of men that feel that they're a little hardened and tough and that they don't need God and they're strong. And, you know, it's interesting. A lot of men tend to think that believers and Christians are wimps or sissies and things, but
yeah, and somehow faith in Christ is a crutch.
It's for women and kids.
It's for tough guys.
Yeah,
too. Yeah.
And you know, it takes a real man, a real woman to stand up for Jesus Christ and to have that kind of a gumption. But I preached it all over the world. I mean, on every continent, various venues, and it's brought some people to Christ, especially the Vietnam veterans. And I'm involved in a ministry of reaching out to vets. Of course, there's a bond and a resonance. And now we're trying to focus more of our ministry to the Iraqi and Afghan Gulf War veterans and preach the message to them. Because when you've been in war, you've been in combat, you've been under fire, your brother in arms, no matter age difference or background, or whether you're a believer or not.
Let's talk about the differences between the Vietnam War and its veterans and the Gulf War in Afghanistan and Iraq today and how they're treated. Now, when you came back in the late 60s, it was, wasn't it?
Came back in 69.
69.
A teenager.
Yeah, in 1969, of course, you were a kid, but you weren't welcomed home with open arms in those days, were you?
Well, for 13 months on the ground in Vietnam, you live for that, what is called DEROS, you know, the date that you come back home. And as opposed to World War II guys who didn't know when they were coming home and they were in for the duration, at least we knew we were coming home. The average guy had a 12-month tour. Marines had an extra month, a 13-month tour. And you kind of live for that moment. It kind of kept you going, and you kept what is called a short-timers calendar, and you marked off the days. And then when you had less than 10 days to go, you called yourself a double-digit midget. You were a short-timer, and you were short a double-digit midget.
Right.
And I had a little disconnect when I came home. The commanding officer on the airplane, as we took off from Da Nang Airport in what we call the Freedom Bird, he just said, now when you get into America, take your uniform off and don't tell anybody that you were in Vietnam. And I always thought that when guys come home from war, they get a parade or...
Sure,
you know,
that's World War II,
yeah,
and we got ticker tape parades.
Yeah, but what was really bizarre is when we got into the airport in California, up on a higher rafter tier, there were demonstrators and protesters, and they were screaming and yelling at us, calling us names. Some of them actually had plastic bags with dog and cat urine on it, and they dumped it on some of us, called us names. And I am not exaggerating when I say they actually took us and put us behind a cage. It was like a bullpen to protect the demonstrators from us, because some of the guys would go after them. So we were in that bullpen like we were caged, and that was not what I was expecting when I was coming home. And there was a little bit of a disconnect there. Some of the Vietnam veterans were rejected. There was a twofold rejection that was very painful. First of all, they were asked to fight in a war that their government wouldn't allow them to really win the way you had D-Day and VE Day and VJ Day in the Second World War. It was a war of attrition, of course, and we fought over the same ground over and over again. But the rejection came twofold. We were rejected a lot by our parents and fathers and uncles who said, well, you guys lost that war, or that wasn't a real war. But it was real blood that I saw, and I shed a little bit of blood over there, not a whole lot, but that was real blood. But we also got rejected, and I think this is what hurt the most, by our own generation, by our own peers and things. And that all changed thanks to the Gulf War. And all of a sudden, the Gulf War heroes changed the attitude about the military, and then all of a sudden now it's reversed. And
now people are thankful for their service.
Oh, man.
And it's totally changed.
I've had guys my age come up to me and tell me that, man, I didn't serve in Vietnam now. I wish I would have.
Right.
What a
So
reversal.
But
there's some differences. World War II, the average GI was 26 years of age. In Vietnam, it was 19. And you and I know, and you know as a viewer, there's a big difference between 25 and 19, 18.
Sure.
Plus,
being a kid or being a man.
Yeah,
really.
and plus in World War II, you trained with the same unit. You got your advanced training. You shipped over with the same unit. You landed in Sicily or North Africa or Europe or Guadalcanal or wherever else with the same unit, and you served through the whole war. And in many cases, if you were lucky, you went home with the same unit. Vietnam was kind of a disconnection because everybody, you didn't really go over, except for the first guys that went over. But after the war got going, you would go with a group, and then you would go to a different unit, and you would never see the guys you came over with in the airplane or at the staging center, and you were assigned. And then you came home generally by yourself without the... What I'm saying is there wasn't unit cohesion, and that helps bring morale. Another area, too, another issue beside the age is that there was a goal of victory both in the Pacific and both in Europe. There was a full-fledged surrender, and you didn't have that in Vietnam. And you're seeing a little bit of this in Iraq and even in Afghanistan right now, that, you know, what is victory? And our president said we're not going to have a VJ or VE Day type victory. And so the lines were not defined. Now, I want you to know that militarily we beat the enemy, the Viet Cong, the NVA, every single time in any major engagement. But it was a psychological defeat because the government took away that victory, you know, from us, and guys are hurting from that. The Gulf War had a quick resolve, a 100-hour ground war, and victory was assured, and there was a definite victory and things like that. So I always jokingly have said that in the Korean War we tied, and we won World War II, and Vietnam, the win was taken away from us on a technicality by the government. So a lot of Vietnam vets have some deep-seated resentment and bitterness toward our government, and a lot of them are anti-church because they felt that the church was part of the establishment, because many of the protesters were from church bodies also. So there's a big difference. Plus the Gulf War guys got that big parade June the 10th, I believe, 1991, through Broadway, the parade of heroes and ticker tapes. And by the way, I was in that parade.
Were you really?
Yeah, they had a bunch of Vietnam vets that the Gulf War guys wanted to be there, so I marched with them in front before Colin Powell and Schwarzkopf, and 4 to 5 million people cheering us on. And when the Vietnam veterans went by, as we stood by, I mean, the applause and the cheering was fantastic. So I got my parade, but the best thing is that I found Jesus Christ and committed my life to Him as Lord while I was in the Marine Corps.
Let's talk about that just a little bit, and I don't want to spoil the surprise that's coming where you tell the entire story, but you came to Christ actually in Vietnam, didn't you? Or
it was what
later?
happened in Vietnam that later I connected the dots. I connected all the dots, and at the end of this documentary, at this broadcast, I give my sermon message that I've preached all over the world, all over America, and I want to preach all over the place to reach out and minister to our men and women who wear the uniform and our veterans. It took a string of events to finally get me to that point. up until that time, as I grew up in San Jose, California, I felt that, well, there was a God, but he's way up there. I'm down here. He don't bug me. I won't bug him. And God doesn't mess around or care about, 16, 17-year-old boys growing up in San Jose, California. War, Vietnam, those kind of things change that, and you begin to see things from a different perspective and all that.
I'll bet you do. In addition to traveling the world for Billy Graham, perhaps the greatest evangelist of the 20th century, you also were on staff for quite a while, years, at Saddleback with Rick Warren. Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, that was great. With Rick Warren, what you see is what you get. He's genuine, and it was a growing church, and I was involved with their evangelism, their missions, and their outreach. I got to do purpose-driven conferences all over the world, and we did some team preaching and things, and it was just great. I've been blessed. I got to work with Billy Graham and got to work with Rick Warren, and the two of the greatest men of God in evangelism and outreach and church building. And so I am totally blessed. And I had a unique message with my Mortal Midnight testimony, and that opened up a lot of doors, but it was great.